compete and see how you could benefit much from international trade. And this, which two goods, it's a bit silly, because you have food and cloth, whatever, agricultural products and industry, and it doesn't make sense to think that you're trading against a big country and you will be able to produce all of the agricultural products yourself, even though you're so tiny. But with this extension of the continuum of goods, the predictions are a lot more plausible. So here are two figures. The first one is one that shows that home, which is a small economy, has a higher productivity in all sectors until it reaches that one line. So home has a higher relative productivity in all goods from this to that. Yeah? However, the general equilibrium result is that home will end up by only producing a small range. But as you can see, even though home, the typical small country, it could be Luxembourg, it could be even Switzerland or Norway and so on, or Denmark, even though home is tiny compared to foreign, and produces only this small range of goods from 0 to n. So it inputs the vast majority of stuff. Home, as you can see, has a higher relative wage. But if the wage were the same between the two regions, home and foreign, this omega would be equal to 1. As you can see in this example, the relative wage is twice as big as in foreign. Yeah? So home, as you can see, is gaining from trade, even though it's a small country. What happens is that it's being able to specialize in the goods in which it has a relatively high, higher productivity. And this one is even more extreme, but it captures the same sort of idea. So whereas in the previous diagram, I was kind of saying, you're a small country, but you can still produce half of the stuff pretty well, because your productivity was above 1 for half of the goods. Here it's much more plausible if you're really a small country with very little land and so on, and very few natural resources. So actually your productivity would be much, much lower for most goods. As you can see, the RD line lies way below 1 for nearly all of the goods. Yeah? However, you can still benefit from trade, that is, and you definitely benefit a lot more than the big country by not being forced to live under autocy, that is, self-sufficient to produce everything. Were you forced to produce everything, as you can see, your relative wage would, relative wage would be somewhere in between the 0 and the 1, so somewhere in here. Now that you're able to specialize very, very substantially, you end up with a relative wage that is higher than foreign. Even though you can only produce a few goods at a lower price and cost. Yeah? So this shows you that, as predicted by trade theory, being small is not going to be does not mean that you're not able to engage in international trade. Most of the time, a small open economy will end up by benefiting substantially more than the big economy. And the basic reason is captured by this. Because a small economy is bound to be inferior at producing the majority of goods because of all sorts of constraints, including lack of key factors of production, such as land. Yeah? So this is just a brief summary. I would emphasize this. So small countries may benefit a lot more from trade than large countries. That's indeed the case. And one of the readings goes into some empirical evidence for this. Yeah? So gigantic US actually benefits less from trade than small Denmark. Yeah? And that's why when you look at their ratio of exports relative to GDP, their measure of openness, the smaller an economy, all else being the same, the greater that ratio, because they have to specialize massively. So Singapore has a ratio of exports and imports to GDP, which is greater than GDP itself. Yeah? And so does the Netherlands. Okay, there's just a little bit of evidence before we move on to the second topic. So this is a famous study, and you can have that in your textbook, so I don't need to go into any detail here. This is comparing productivity in the US and the UK for 26 industries, manufacturing industries. And what you get is that even though the US was better at producing everything, so that they had higher, an absolute advantage in every single one of those industries, it was still the case that there was trade, and not too surprisingly, the greater the relative advantage in productivity, so measured on the horizontal axis, the greater the percentage of exports of the US in those industries relative to the UK. So there's a very clear positive relation. The greater my comparative advantage, the more likely it is that I will be exporting that's exactly those products, and that's exactly what you get in this example. Now I'll move on to another example. It's a bit dated, the numbers, but it captures the basic idea. China and Germany, about 20 years ago, so a little bit dated, China had a much lower productivity than Germany, not too surprisingly, much lower education, technology was also very different, and much lower capital per worker. So all of that, we know, means that on average, a Chinese worker were going to be substantially less productive. However, this is just an average. So when you now look at a particular industry, so apparel relative compared to all manufacturing, you see that even though the typical Chinese worker would only be producing in 1995, so this is now much, much greater, 5% of the typical German worker, it would actually be producing about 20% in that particular industry. And so, yes, they have a low productivity, so they have an absolute disadvantage in all the industries, but they have clearly a comparative advantage in this one. And so one would expect Germany to accept that and be importing a lot of these products in this sector, in this apparel, from China, and that's exactly what you have in here. So even though the size of the Chinese economy relative to Germany's in 1995 was 71%, now it's of course substantially greater than 100%, much, much bigger. In apparel it was 800%, so this means that China was massively exporting products in this industry because it had a comparative advantage in that sector. Okay, well that's it really. As always, this is just an introduction, so if you go have a look at the readings, you'll see that there's a lot more stuff. And one of the readings that is really, really good is the one that is entitled Putting Ricardo at Work, and Eaton and Kortum, and it's in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and most of it is written in plain English, and you have a lot of empirical evidence. So for those of you that are ambitious, as I told you, once you've mastered the basic stuff, which is lectures and the textbook stuff, then you should go back and read some more. Yeah? So it adds to the breadth of your articles. Okay, well, this is now the second topic. Full screen. And the second topic goes into stuff that was not covered by the first. And in particular, it tackles this idea that clearly there's so much opposition to trade inside countries. Clearly not everyone gains. So it may well be that overall there are gains from trade, and this is exactly what we're going to get yet again in this theory, so it's more of the same. So in terms of production possibility frontiers and utility curves, trade just shifts our utility curves to the right, so every society is able to consume more of everything, in principle. What we'll see is that not all factors benefit. And so, intuitively, if I were close to trade and then when I open my doors to trade, there's going to be a lot of stuff that is imported that uses low-skilled workers, then it's very, very likely that the people that used to work in the low-skilled industries in my country at home will suffer. Yeah? And they will. And so what we'll see is that, in principle, there would be enough extra income to compensate the losers. But as always, it's in principle. It may well be that the state does not have the right structures to help people in the transition. But the idea that you're going to be condemning someone to being unemployed for the rest of their lives is obviously nonsense. Yes, it may well be that for 20 years there were miners, but if you spend enough money as a state in helping them, it may well be that they have a second life as doing something completely different. Yeah? However, if you don't help them, yes, it may well be that they will no longer work anywhere else. Yeah? So, factor proportions theory, it's going to, the way we get these sorts of results is by, of course, becoming now a little bit more realistic and saying, let's not just focus on productivity and labour productivity, let's focus on several factors of production. And as always, we start with the Mickey Mouse approach. We start with two goods, two factors of production, and then we move on gradually to more complicated stuff. But much of it is going to be in the extra readings. Yeah? So this is what we're going to do. It's called factor proportions theory because the reason for trade between countries is that we have different proportions of the factors of production. So it's obvious that some countries are blessed with having a lot of oil underground. So and other countries have very, very little. So there's going to be a big difference here. Some countries are blessed with a lot of land, others have very little land. So there's going to be a big difference in the factors of production. And because goods will be using those factors of production in different amounts or different proportions, you're going to get a reason for trade. Exporting stuff that uses your abundant factors relatively intensively and importing the other things. Yeah? So that's what we're going to get in factor proportions theory. And the people that initiated this stuff were two Swedish economists. One was an economic historian. And Sinner around? There's at least one Swedish person around. They would be able to pronounce these names correctly. So Bertil Ohlin and Heckscher, the two Swedes, and you can read the quotes while I drink my tea. All right? Can I move on?